Take any country on Earth, anyone you like, rich or poor, peaceful or at war, with excellent healthcare, or almost none at all. Now look at how long men live there compared to women. In every single one of them without exception, women live longer, not slightly on average. Globally, the gap sits somewhere around 5 years. In some countries, it narrows to 2 or 3. In others, it stretches past 10. But the direction never flips. Not in Japan, not in Nigeria, not in Sweden or Brazil or Russia or anywhere else. Records have been kept carefully enough to check a pattern that universal, holding across every culture, every diet, every economic system, and every historical period we have data for, is not a coincidence. It is a signal. And the obvious explanation, the one most people reach for, immediately turns out to explain far less than you would expect. That explanation is behavior. Men take more risks, men smoke and drink more. Historically, men work more dangerous jobs, men are more likely to die violently, and less likely to see a doctor when something feels wrong. All of that is true. All of it matters. It genuinely accounts for a meaningful portion of the gap. But it cannot account for all of it. And there is a very specific piece of evidence that proves it. To see why, imagine you could remove every one of those behavioral factors. No smoking, no dangerous occupations, no violence, no risk-taking, no differences in how often anyone visits a doctor. If behavior were the whole story, the gap should vanish. It does not. It shrinks. In populations where those factors are more equal, but it never disappears, and it never reverses. And there's one group of human beings for whom behavior cannot possibly be a factor at all. Male fetuses are more likely to be lost during pregnancy than female fetuses. Newborn boys die at higher rates than newborn girls in essentially every population studied. A newborn has not made a single lifestyle choice. It has not smoked a cigarette or taken a risk or refused to see a doctor. Which means whatever is happening here starts long before behavior can possibly explain it. It starts before birth. If you enjoy the questions where the obvious answer turns out to be incomplete, take a second to subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you. Now, let's look at what is actually driving this. The most striking evidence for a biological floor underneath this gap comes from a study published in 2018 led by the researcher Virginia Zarulli. The team did something clever. Rather than compare men and women under ordinary conditions where lifestyle differences muddy everything, they looked at populations under catastrophic conditions. They examined historical data from famines, from epidemics, and from periods of extreme mortality, including the Irish famine, a severe famine in Sweden, measles epidemics in Iceland, and the brutal conditions endured by freed slaves in Liberia in the 1800s. These were situations where life expectancy collapsed to shockingly low levels, sometimes under 20 years, and where lifestyle advantages had essentially no meaning at all. The finding was consistent. Even under those conditions, women survived better than men, and the researchers were able to narrow it further. Much of that survival advantage was concentrated among infants. Baby girls were surviving these catastrophes at higher rates than baby boys, in conditions where behavior, occupation, smoking, and healthcare access could not possibly have been factors. That result tells us something important. Beneath every cultural and behavioral factor, there is a biological layer, and it favors females. So what is that biological layer? The leading explanation is beautifully simple, and it comes down to a single chromosome. Human females carry 2X chromosomes, human males carry 1X and 1Y. Now consider what that means at the level of genetic error. Every human being carries harmful mutations. It is unavoidable. Genes get copied imperfectly and damage accumulates. If a woman inherits a damaged gene on one X chromosome, she usually has a second functional copy on her other X chromosome to compensate. The healthy version can mask the broken one. A man has no backup. His single X chromosome is fully exposed. Whatever is written on it, functional or damaged, gets expressed with nothing to compensate. This is not a theoretical concern. It is the reason a whole category of conditions known as X-linked disorders affect males far more frequently than females. Color blindness is the most familiar example. Hemophilia is another in each case. A woman carrying the damaged gene often has a working copy that covers for it, while a man carrying the identical gene has no such protection. Now, extend that logic outward, past the well-known conditions to the thousands of small, unremarkable genetic imperfections every person carries across an entire lifetime. In every tissue, the sex with a spare copy has a margin the other simply does not. Researchers call this the unguarded X hypothesis, and it does not merely sound plausible. It makes a testable prediction, and the test is genuinely elegant. If having two matching sex chromosomes is protective, then the pattern should reverse in species where the sexes are flipped. And there are such species in birds and in butterflies. It is the female that carries two different sex chromosomes and the male that carries a matching pair. The genetic arrangement is the mirror image of ours, so if the hypothesis holds in those species, males should live longer than females. A large analysis published in 2020 by Joee and colleagues examined lifespan data across a wide range of animal species and found exactly that pattern. Across the animal kingdom, the sex carrying two matching sex chromosomes tended to live longer, whichever sex that happened to be in mammals. That is the female. In birds and butterflies, it is the male. The pattern follows the chromosomes, not the sex. That is a remarkably strong result, and it suggests something humbling. Part of why men die earlier may have nothing to do with men or with human society at all. It may simply be what happens to whichever sex lacks a genetic backup copy, but chromosomes are not the whole story. And the second factor is one people find considerably more provocative. Testosterone does a great many things, and one of them appears to be suppressing certain immune functions. Biologists have long noted a trade-off here, sometimes described as the immunocompetence handicap. The same hormone that drives the traits associated with male competition and reproduction may come at a cost to immune defense and long-term maintenance. The evidence for this in animals is fairly clear. Castrated male domestic animals, including cats, dogs, and sheep, tend to live longer than intact males of the same species. This is a well-documented veterinary observation. The human evidence is far more limited, for obvious reasons, but one study drew enormous attention. In 2012, researchers examined genealogical records of eunuchs who served in the Korean royal court during the Joseon dynasty, comparing their lifespans to men of similar social standing from the same era. The eunuchs, according to the analysis, lived substantially longer by a striking margin, with an unusually high proportion reaching very advanced ages. It is important to be honest about the limitations here. The sample was small. Historical records from that period are imperfect. Court eunuchs lived under unusual conditions with different diets, different work, and different stresses from the comparison group. The finding is suggestive rather than conclusive, and researchers continue to debate it, but it points in the same direction as the animal data, and that consistency is difficult to dismiss entirely. The reverse side of this is estrogen, which appears to be actively protective in several ways. Estrogen has antioxidant properties and appears to offer cardiovascular protection during the reproductive years. This may help explain a pattern. Cardiologists have documented for decades that serious heart disease tends to appear in women roughly a decade later than in men, with rates rising notably after menopause. So one sex is being given a protective hormone during the years that matter most for survival, and the other is being given a hormone that appears to trade long-term maintenance for short-term competitive advantage. There's a third mechanism, and it may be the strangest of all. It involves mitochondria, the small structures inside your cells that produce energy. Mitochondria carry their own separate DNA, entirely distinct from the DNA in your cell nucleus. Here is the crucial detail. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited almost exclusively from your mother. Your father's mitochondria are essentially not passed on. Now think about what that means for natural selection. A mutation in mitochondrial DNA that harms women will be selected against ruthlessly, because it damages the line through which those mitochondria travel to the next generation. But a mutation that harms only men and leaves women unaffected is effectively invisible to selection. It passes through mothers generation after generation, causing damage exclusively in sons, and nothing ever filters it out. Researchers call this the mother's curse, and studies in fruit flies have demonstrated the effect directly, identifying mitochondrial variants that impair males while leaving females largely untouched. There is something almost unsettling about the implication. Natural selection is often imagined as a force that steadily removes harmful traits from a population, but it can only remove what it can see. Anything that harms exclusively the sex that does not pass the gene on is, in a very literal sense, outside its field of vision. How much this contributes in humans is still being investigated, but the logic is airtight, and it describes a genuine evolutionary blind spot, one that can only ever accumulate damage in one direction. Now, having established all of that biology, it is worth returning to behavior, because the biological floor is not the ceiling. The size of the gap moves, and it moves in ways that reveal exactly how much culture contributes on top of the biology. Consider smoking. Across much of the 20th century, men in many countries took up smoking decades before women did, and at far higher rates. The health consequences arrived decades later, widening the mortality gap substantially. As smoking rates converged in later decades, the gap in several countries narrowed measurably. Consider Russia in the 1990s, where the gap between male and female life expectancy stretched beyond a decade, driven heavily by alcohol, social upheaval, and related causes affecting men far more severely. Consider the mortality curve of young adulthood. In many countries, there is a visible spike in male deaths during the late teens and 20s, driven by accidents, violence, and risk-taking. Demographers sometimes call it the accident hump, and it is overwhelmingly male. And consider the historical record, which is perhaps the most revealing of all. The 5-year gap most people assume is permanent is not permanent at all. In many countries, the difference between male and female life expectancy was considerably smaller a century ago, widened dramatically through the middle of the 20th century, and has been narrowing again in recent decades. A biological constant does not behave like that. Chromosomes did not change between 1900 and 1970. What changed was what men and women did, what they were exposed to, and what killed them. None of these are chromosomal. All of them are cultural, and all of them stack on top of a biological baseline that already tilted the same way. Which is why the honest answer to this question is layered, rather than singular. Biology sets a floor. Culture decides how far above that floor the gap actually sits. And then there's one final detail, which is the strangest twist in the whole subject. Women live longer, but across many measures, women report more illness, more chronic conditions, and more disability across their lifespans than men do. Researchers call this the male-female health survival paradox. The sex that lives longer is not necessarily the sex that feels healthier along the way. The proposed explanations vary. Men may be more likely to develop conditions that kill quickly, particularly cardiovascular ones. Women may be more likely to develop conditions that persist for decades without being immediately fatal, including many autoimmune conditions, which affect women at notably higher rates. That last point connects back to where we started. A more aggressive immune system defends better against infection, which may be part of why female infants survive epidemics at higher rates. But a more aggressive immune system also carries a higher risk of turning against the body it defends. Even the advantage, in other words, comes with a bill attached. Step back, and the whole picture assembles into something more interesting than the version most people carry around. Men do not die earlier simply because they take risks, although they do. They do not die earlier simply because of hormones or chromosomes or mitochondria, although each of those appears to contribute. They die earlier because several independent mechanisms operating at completely different levels, from the genome to the endocrine system to the culture, all happen to point in the same direction at once. An unguarded chromosome with no backup copy, a hormone that trades maintenance for competition, a set of mitochondrial genes that evolution has no reason to fix in males, and a set of cultural expectations layered on top that push in the same direction again. Somewhere right now, a boy is being born and a girl is being born in the same hospital on the same day. Statistically, she will outlive him, not because of anything either of them will choose, and not because of anything anyone will do to them. The difference was already there, written into a chromosome, a hormone, and a set of genes handed down from a mother before either of them took a single breath.